already know this, right? But our mindset, it matters immensely in how we process and we deal with the hardship and the suffering that's literally all around us. A friend of mine, he was wearing a t-shirt that crystallizes this, and we'll put it up on the screen. The phrase that he said that was on his shirt says, "Your mentality is your reality." Your mentality is your reality. Now, if you've heard of CBT or cognitive behavioral therapy, this idea is basically the foundation. The American Psychological Association, or the APA, they write that the first core principle of CBT is that psychological problems are based in part on faulty or unhelpful ways of thinking. Now, this isn't just modern psychology that tells us this. This is a deeply biblical idea. It goes back at least 2,000 years to the time of Jesus and of St. Paul. Now, Paul, he writes this in Romans. He says, "Be transformed by the renewal of your mind." You want a better way to deal with the stress of 2020, a better way to deal with the anxiety from this constant uncertainty? Do you want to be transformed? Then it starts with the way that you view the world and how you process what is happening around you. It starts in your mindset. Now, there have been other times on these Zoom calls where we've handled topics of ways that Christians are getting it wrong. We talked about why Christians are so hypocritical, why they're judgmental, why they make the Bible say things it was never intending to say. But for these next 3 weeks, I want to show you how Christianity actually gets it right, how it offers you a new mindset that, in my opinion, and the opinion of actually about a third of the whole world's population, is actually better than any of the other mindsets out there. And I believe that it's the best possible way forward through 2020, 2021, and even beyond that. Now, before we talk about the Christian mindset, I want to talk about a common mindset that I see people taking when it comes to suffering and hardships in 2020. We're going to talk about one mindset this week, another next week, and a last one on week 3. And we actually have a guest speaker on the 3rd week, so get excited about that. So the first mindset that I think is probably not working for us in 2020 when it comes to hardship and suffering is to avoid it. The 2020 mindset that we are all probably taking at some level is to just avoid it. Avoid suffering at all costs. This was the initial response of many of us probably when COVID first started getting going. We were making spreadsheets. We started tallying, the case counts, comparing it to the death rates. And we did this because we didn't want to go through the hardship and the suffering that would come from getting COVID. But even before COVID, this mindset most of us take when it comes to hardship of all different types. Lesser ones even than a pandemic, just ones in regular everyday living. When you've got a friend who's hard to be around, your friends tell you to avoid that person, right? Avoid that toxic person. If someone asks you out and you don't like them, you don't really tell them and have that hard conversation. You just ghost them. If you don't like what people are posting online, you unfollow them because you want to avoid that negativity in your life. If you get in a fight with the person you're dating, you usually avoid that hard conversation by pretending the whole thing really never happened. And this is in part the deeper reason why we all go to the gym and we eat healthy, because we want to avoid dying. Now, there are 2 problems with this, and the first one you can probably guess. It's that this mindset doesn't work. You can't avoid hardship and suffering no matter how many toxic people you cut out of your life. You can't avoid being taken advantage of by the company you work for, no matter how much you advocate for yourself. No matter what you do, no matter how many spreadsheets you make, no matter how much contact tracing you do, you still can't control what happens to you. You can't control if you get COVID or not, unless you literally lock yourself in your house until we have a vaccine. And eventually, no matter what you do, you can't avoid dying. None of us can get out of that one. Now, the second problem with this mindset, you may not be aware of. When you avoid suffering, you miss an incredible opportunity. And this is where the distinctly Christian mindset comes into play. The Christian mindset that we're going to talk about, it's all over the Bible, but we're going to be looking at it specifically in one of Paul's letters. And I'm going to have Leslie, she's going to read some verses so that you can see this mindset in action. And then I'll make a few comments as she goes. Now, to give you a little bit of background, at this point in Paul's life, he was in prison for believing in Jesus and preaching what we call as Christians the gospel, which is just a word that means good news. So while he's in jail, he says this. It starts with chapter 1 in Philippians, verse 29, and I'm going to turn it over to Leslie. We're going to throw it up on the screen.
For you've been given not only the privilege of trusting in Christ, but also the privilege of suffering for him. We are in this struggle together. You have seen my struggle in the past, and you know that I am still in the midst of it.
Now, I just want to pause there for a second. Look at that phrasing. Paul says the other Christians have the privilege of suffering for Jesus. How is suffering a privilege? That's like the main thing that all of us are trying to avoid. But Paul, he explains it. Here's what it says in chapter 2, verse 5.
You must have the same attitude that Christ Jesus had.
See that word attitude? You can replace that with mindset. You need to have the mindset of Jesus when it comes to suffering and hardship. So what was the mindset? Paul, he explains it in verse 6.
Though he was God, he did not think of equality with God as something to cling to. Instead, he gave up his divine privileges. He took the humble position of a slave and was born as a human being. When he appeared in human form, he humbled himself in obedience to God and died a criminal's death on a cross.
All right. Thank you, Leslie. This is an incredibly famous set of verses. You might have heard this at some point in your life. Some people think this was actually an early Christian creed that was being circulated, that Christians were saying, and Paul just drops it in to make his point, to give an insight of what Jesus' mindset actually was. So we're going to look at this in a couple different pieces, and there's 4 pieces we can look at. The first one, Jesus was God. So that's the first piece to know. Who was Jesus? Jesus was God, and this is something that we as Christians believe, that even though he was born as a human and lived as a human, that's not debated by anyone. Historians don't debate that. Everyone believes Jesus was a real person who lived and was executed. Christians, we believe that he actually was equal with God, that he was God. The second point is that Jesus didn't hold on to his authority. He didn't say, well, because I'm God, then I'm going to use my power to avoid suffering. He doesn't do that. Instead, Jesus humbles himself. And that's what Paul says. He humbles himself. He puts himself in a position of humility. He says he compares himself to a slave, someone whose sole purpose is to love and care for other people. And he goes as far to even willingly go to his death. Because of the message that Jesus was preaching, he angered the religious authorities of his day so much that they got him sentenced to be executed. And at several points, Jesus could have used his power to stop this process, to get himself freed from his captors and avoid any suffering that he's going to have to maybe go through. But when he gets captured, one of his followers takes out a sword and cuts off one of the guards' ears. One of the guards who's going to take Jesus to get executed. So one of Jesus' followers cuts off his ear. But Jesus, he tells him to put away his sword. And then Jesus says this, "Don't you realize that I could ask my Father," meaning God, "for thousands of angels to protect us, and he would send them instantly? But if I did, how would the scriptures be fulfilled that describe what must happen now?" Jesus, he could have avoided suffering, and ultimately he could have avoided dying, but he doesn't. Why? Because he knew that his death would accomplish something amazing, something great. We believe as Christians that when Jesus died, he takes on all of the sins of the world. And that word sin is kind of like a Christian phrase, but it's basically just anything that people have ever done wrong that created a barrier between humans and God. And so when Jesus dies, he takes on all the sins that form that barrier, and the sins die with him. And why is that important? It's because it removes the barrier between us and God, and it allows us to enter back into relationship with our Father, with our God who created us and loves us. Jesus' death, it makes reconciliation possible. The only thing that we have left to do is just accept that gift from Jesus and to put our trust in him rather than trusting in ourselves. This is what we call the gospel, or the good news. Like I said earlier, it means because of Jesus' death, any of that shame that we may experience, any guilt that we might harbor, it's removed once and for all. Now, if you're here on this call and you want that, you haven't already put your faith in Jesus, it's as simple as speaking to God and saying, "God, I want to put my trust in you rather than putting my faith and my trust in myself. I want to begin following you today." Now, Jesus's mindset, it allowed him to endure suffering. It allowed him to endure even death because he knew it was for a greater purpose. But equally as important, Jesus knows what comes on the other side of that suffering, on the other side of death. As Christians, we believe Jesus didn't stay dead. We believe that the Romans, they used a cross. Basically, they hung him on a cross. They nailed through his hands, and they used this to execute him. He actually died by not like blood loss, but asphyxiation. You die from not being able to breathe. You have to lift yourself up, and eventually you suffocate to death. But we believe that God brings him back to life 3 days later. Now, Paul says this in the next section. Remember, he just said that Jesus' attitude was one where he humbled himself to the point of allowing himself to be killed in this horrible, horrible method of crucifixion. I'm going to ask Leslie to read this last section right here.
Therefore, God elevated him to the place of highest honor and gave him the name above all other names, that at the name of Jesus, every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue declare that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father.
Thank you so much, Leslie. On the other side of Jesus' death, it's resurrection. It's being exalted by God. Now, when you think about this, you've probably heard the phrase, if you've been in church, we need to follow Jesus. We need to follow Jesus. You need to follow Jesus. Where's he going? Where do you follow him? He's going to the cross. He's going to die. To have the mindset of Christ means following him directly into the suffering. But we don't go alone. Jesus already went ahead of us, and he goes with us as we head to that death. And we also know that death isn't the end. We know that on the other side of death is a resurrection. Now, maybe you're thinking that I just want us Christians to be focused on heaven, but that's not super helpful for the suffering that doesn't end in us literally dying. There's a lot of stuff that we have to go through where we don't die, but we have to keep living with the consequences of those suffering. What does resurrection look like in those instances? Now, Paul Miller, he's the author of a couple really good books, but one of them that I've been reading is called J-Curve. And I've been making my way through this, and it's completely reshaping how I think about these insane times that we're living in. We may think that following God looks like this, just an arrow going up and to the right. The longer that we stay faithful, the better our lives get. The more that we follow God, maybe if we're in ministry, the more people will come to our ministry. Maybe the more we follow, that means we're going to get a good marriage. Maybe that we're going to get a good job, all these things. I'm trusting in God. I'm following him. My life is going to get better and better and better. But Paul Miller says this is not the case. He follows what Paul says and what Jesus says, and said that the Christian life is actually a series of J's. Now look at the shape J. You could see with the J shape that it always has to go down before it goes up. It has to get worse before it gets better. God uses these hardships to do amazing things in us and through us. And the entire Christian experience is a never-ending series of mini deaths and mini resurrection, of that J curve over and over and over again. We follow Jesus into the suffering and then into the resurrection. Now, let me give you an example from my own life. My wife and I, we were at a church downtown for the last 4 years, maybe 4.5. And I was just loving what I was doing. I was working there. And we moved out of the city to the suburbs to be closer to my wife's job. And so I got a job back at our home church where we met each other, where we met in the youth group. We ended up getting married there. So we had left that church, but then we came back for it. Now, the church that I was in Chicago, it was growing and it was launching new locations. And then I left that church and came to my home church. And that church also was doing pretty well. The church that I work for now, they were launching 5 campuses over the course of like 5 or so years. And I was brought on to launch the 5th campus. So I was going to be a campus pastor who launched a new location. We were looking around for a neighborhood where it might be. And this was like a promotion, because at my last job, I was technically an associate pastor, and then I was going to become a campus pastor. And in the Christianese world, the Christian hierarchy, campus pastor's one level up. So I'm like, this is great. And so it felt like, hey, I've been faithful. My life's going up and to the right. Everything's getting better and better and better. I left a good legacy behind, and I'm like, man, it's just getting better and better and better. But a few weeks after that I start, COVID hits. The whole plan to launch a new campus goes out the window. And now I'm stuck every day having to edit and mix the audio for this new live stream that we had to launch. That's what I spend all my days doing. And then all the momentum from pastoring in the city seemed like it was gone. The service that I had been the pastor of back in the city, it was shut down altogether. My entire legacy was destroyed. And then in my new position, I wasn't preaching, I wasn't leading, I wasn't using any of the gifts that I felt like God had given me for the church. And I'm a very extroverted person, and now I'm working at home alone in the house all day, and there was like no path forward. It's like, what could this even come of? All these things had been closed. All these doors forward had been closed. Now, why did God do this? I think in part, he used this pandemic to humble me. He was showing in me places where I had become prideful, where I had looked back at my own accomplishments for my own justification, but watching as every part of my professional career was removed and the legacy was destroyed, anything I had done, it reminded me I'm not in charge of my own destiny. The only success that I ever experienced was a gift of God working through me, and he could take it away at any point. Now, I'm not saying I think he sent the pandemic specifically for me, but we know that God, he works in mysterious ways and he uses things in ways that we wouldn't expect. And so I slunk into this period of indifference for a few months in early COVID, but then I started to experience resurrection. God started renewing in me a sense of his love, and I started to find myself wanting to read the Bible more and pray more because I had nothing else to point to for my validation. And so what did I do? I just looked to Jesus. And in this place of humility, God birthed this online community that you are in here today. And even in these last few months, I've seen God doing more incredible things in this community, in the lives of many of you, in some ways more than I had in the last 5 years of ministry. I hear stories almost daily of the ways that people in this community are loving each other and even sharing that same good news about Jesus with people, with their friends who don't know him yet. So you see, I needed to go through suffering, the down part of the J curve, following Jesus into his death in order to experience a resurrection. And if I was successful in avoiding suffering on the front end, I probably would have continued down a path of pride and arrogance, and the unhealthy tendencies in me would be increased and probably cause who knows how many problems for that congregation. If your 2020 mindset of avoiding suffering is not working for you, I want to encourage you to think about this differently, to take the mindset of Christ. And what is that? That is to follow him to death and to resurrection. Follow him daily through that J curve. This mindset, in my opinion, is the only way that we can have real, genuine hope that sustains us. Now, we're going to transition. The second part of our time together is we bring on some panelists, some guests to talk about this. You're not just hearing from me. We try to bring on people who have some significant pieces that they can add to this type of discussion, because my guess is you're going to have a lot of different things running through your head. Maybe things you're like, that doesn't make sense. That doesn't apply here. That's not good. So we're hoping that this conversation we have with these panelists will be a way to kind of flesh that out. So two of them you have seen before, but tonight they're much more in their wheelhouse. Rachel Cope, she's going to be on. She's a social worker at a charter school in the city, working with children and families. And Sabrina Massey is also on the call. And Sabrina is, what did she call herself? The queen of the land, something? No, I'm just kidding. She's a licensed social worker specializing in trauma and crisis in children and adolescents. So we're going to be talking through the implications of this Christian mindset when it comes to real world issues. Like maybe you heard what I went through and you're like, that's nothing. My life has been way harder. I've had way harder things that I've had to go through because of COVID. And I think you're probably right. So we're going to try to talk through this. And each week we've been trying to get better with this, like interacting with the people in the chat. And I don't think we've done the best job. I think some of you have put comments in and we didn't really get a chance to reference them. And so we've been trying to figure out the good rhythm. So what we're going to do tonight is chat in as much as you can during the time together. But we're basically going to have like 15 to 20 minutes where the panel just talks together. And then we're going to leave the last 10 to 15 minutes just to dialogue with you directly. So we're going to make sure to hit all the questions that we can in that last portion of the time. So feel free to chat in, and if you want to keep your comments a little bit more anonymous, you can send them directly to me, or even if you want to say to one of the things to any of the panelists, feel free to send it directly to them. Otherwise, post it in the public chat. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Vince. He is our moderator for the night, and then we're going to talk until about 8-ish, and then we're going to take questions from like 8 to 8:10 or so. So take it away, Mr. Vince.
All right, thank you, Anthony. How are you guys? Rachel, Sabrina? Thanks for being on the call tonight. So Anthony gave us a lot to think about and covered a lot of ground. And is anything in particular stick out for you guys? Anything that you found impactful or helpful, or something you maybe even disagreed with, or a new insight? What did you guys pick up from this?
So I can go first. I took notes because my memory is not great. So if you see me reading from a piece of paper, that's why. But there were 3 things that stuck out. I'll try to go through them first, but one of them, or try to go through them fast. So the idea, I knew this, but I never thought about it when Anthony said Jesus could have had God send like 1,000 angels to, I mean, that was in the Bible. Anthony didn't, that was from the Bible.
Right.
God could have sent 1,000 angels to prevent the suffering that he was about to go through, but he didn't do that. And so that just makes me think, like, I say suffering has a purpose, but that's like directly shown in that story. So I thought about that.
Rachel, do you think do you think that points to, as Christians, we believe that Jesus is fully God and fully human, right? That option for him not to call in legions of angels, do you think that reflects this? It was like a human decision because he could have got out of it. Because sometimes people think, well, Jesus is God, so what's the big deal? He could,
Right.
he could have endured it, but he had a choice. It sounds like what you're reacting to.
Yeah, but then that makes me think sometimes as humans we don't have a choice. Sometimes, when, especially for people groups that are oppressed or people who have suffered trauma at the hands of family members, right? So sometimes, that kind of opens up a new bag for me. But yeah, I mean, just that, I don't know, just for me it shows that suffering really does have a purpose. I mean, and Jesus's purpose was to save all of humanity. So it was a pretty big thing that happened through his suffering. The other thing that Anthony said was that it usually gets worse before it gets better. I mean, thinking of that J curve, and I think about that all the time in the work that I do in doing therapy with children or adults. And I say that to them sometimes, like, look, we're about to talk about some really, really hard things, and it's going to feel like your life is falling apart as we're trying to put it back together. So I say quite often. And then
Rachel, that's so encouraging, because it's like, I could say this and you'd be like, yeah, so I tell people the exact opposite of what Anthony said. And, I think he was completely wrong.
No, because I mean, we're about to open up these trauma wounds that have, maybe occurred when they were little kids they've never even thought of. Maybe in a session they're going to realize that they were sexually abused, and they never thought about it before. So these really huge things are going to come up and it's going to hurt really bad. Then the other thing I wanted to say lastly was just that when Anthony was sharing his story, I was thinking people from Park are here in this online community as well. And so it's like, that's because of a relationship. They felt probably connected to Anthony in some way. And I mean, I've been connected with the Peary family since I was in 8th grade, right? And I'm still here because it's the relationships that I've built with people in the family that have mattered to me, right? And it's the relationship that I have with Jesus that changes my mindset at the end of the day. So that's
good.
Yeah, those are my.
And Rachel was my substitute teacher at one point when I was in high school, and I skipped school that day, and I got a phone call on our house phone, and I answered and I said, "Who is this?" And she said, "This is Rachel. I'm your teacher. Where are you?" And I was like, it was an amazing moment.
Okay. Yeah, it was great.
Sabrina, how about you?
So I actually had a lot of this. Rachel, you're not alone. I also took notes because that's what I do also. So yeah, we actually had a lot of the same things. Like the J curve was really big for me. I had never seen like a graph like that before, but much like you, Rachel, a lot of times, like I tell myself if I'm going through a hard time, or a friend or a client of mine, if I'm working with them, but like if you actually want to process and actually get through all of the yuck and the crumminess of whatever your hardship is and however you're suffering, you have to actually lean into the suffering and you have to deal with it. You can't just, I'm going to pretend like it's not there and I'm going to avoid it and like move on with my life, because it always just finds a way to bite you in the butt if you don't do that. So that like having a visual was super big for me. Also, Anthony's quote of the little sermon that he gave was, we need to follow Jesus into the suffering, but he comes with us. So like the first half of that sentence, I was like, ugh, I don't want to do that. Like, why? No, like even if I am supposed to do it, I don't want to. That sounds awful. And then there was that huge redemptive piece at the end. But Jesus comes with us. Like, yes, we're going to lean into the suffering, but we are not alone. And we have guidance the whole way through, and someone like basically helping us out with every single step we take, even if it's hard. Anything you do that's hard is 1,000 times harder if you have to do it by yourself. But if you have someone like on your side, like cheering you on and is supporting you and there for you, makes a huge world of a difference. And if that person is Jesus, well, then you are in. You are in. You're good.
Yeah, that's really good. And then Anthony, because you had mentioned that of all the kind of worldviews out there that in your opinion, and probably a lot of people on the call, the Christian mindset, the Christian worldview is far above the other ones. We're not saying that in a boastful or arrogant way, but exactly what Sabrina is saying is that our religion, our faith, is we're the only ones where the great God has endured suffering. And he understands suffering. He was a human being and he comes with us. The other religions can't say that. Their God is either intangible or their God is so above them and so removed. He's never experienced anything like that. So I think that's what sets our mindset apart too. Yeah. That's
it's such a good point. I think the Christian idea, what Christians call the incarnation, God becoming a person, living life, like going through junior high and high school age, as like he grows up, like it says in scripture, he grew in wisdom and stature. So it's like, it's not even like because sometimes you're like, wait, so like if Jesus is God, does he know everything of all time in that moment? Is he thinking about, Subaru and Teslas? Like, is he aware of that, And I think that's like the human nature and the divine nature, some sort of like a distinction there. So he's living as a person, like 2,000 years ago, and he goes through that. And I think that is a very distinctly Christian idea. Some people will tell you that there's like other religions that have similar ideas. Like there was a movie that came out, I can't even remember what it's called, Zeitgeist. That was a big one when I was young, and it was like, these are actually ideas from other religions. But if you actually compare, when they say, there's other religions where God becomes a person, is not the same. It's a completely different thing. So yeah, I think that is a very distinct Christian idea.
Okay. Yeah. So one thing I want to ask you guys is the Apostle Paul and Anthony likes to always be included with the Apostle Paul, but they both say that we're transformed by the renewing of our minds, that we have to change our mindset, right? So basic question is, how do you do that? Is it a matter of will? Is it a matter of prayer? Is it a matter of God has to do it and you just sit back? What would your advice be to anybody to say, okay, you've got to change your mindset? How do you do that?
That is a very big question.
Maybe you would speak like from your professional experience, right? Like when you're having these hard conversations, like, yeah, I'd be curious too.
Yeah. So a lot of it, I think, I don't think there's one set answer. A lot of it is, I think, both. It is God's will, but I think it also, it's personal will. And it always starts with a choice. Like if you really want something to change, you have to be ready to make that change, and you have to be able to get behind going through the hard parts that make that transition happen. So I know it's probably easier said than done. Like, sure, I want to lose 50 pounds. And you start off saying that, yes, I want that, but you have to actually be able to have those actions behind just wanting the change to happen. So there's so much more that goes into it, and it's hard without a concrete example. But in any situation, like God's will is always going to be playing the role, but it's always going to be up to the individual to say, okay, I'm ready to change.
So it's
That's always step one.
a both and.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, and I was going to add to that. I was texting with Sabrina earlier about these questions, and I was reminded of something that my clinical supervisor asked me one time early on in my supervision with her, and she just said, "How do you think people change?" And I was like, why has no one ever asked me this in my profession? Like, this is a really important question for me to think about. And the first thing that just jumped into my mind was, I think people change through relationship. I mean, I know it sounds simple and basic, but I mean, me and Sabrina were saying, like, we can't try any of these specific interventions. Like Anthony mentioned CBT, which is a type, it's a theory, but it's a type of intervention, I guess I would say. But any other type of intervention, you can't do that with a client until they have buy-in and they trust you and they respect you as a person and they feel your positive regard for them. If you don't have that, it doesn't matter what amazing technique or amazing theory that you have to give them. It's probably not going to go very far. And so I don't know, that just, to me, that ties in with like our relationship with God and our relationship with others. Like, people have to know that they're cared for and that they're respected and that you are listening to them, and you have to have active listening skills. I mean, there's so much that goes into that. Isn't it like Jesus is like our greatest counselor or something? Isn't he like named as a counselor? And
Wonderful counselor.
Yeah.
wonderful counselor. Yeah. So relationship. Just going to keep going back to that.
Well, let me ask you guys this. How much do you think a person's personality plays into whether or not they can change their mindset and look at suffering and embrace suffering? I think of somebody like Bob Goff or Mrs. P, who have these kinds of natural personalities, like, we're going to get through this, we're Christians, damn it, that kind of thing. How much do you think a person's personality plays into, and Anthony can answer this one too, into being able to change their, maybe some people are just built mentally to flip that switch and say, hey, we got to embrace this, and it's, we're going to the cross. So what would you guys think?
I'll say a quick comment, and then I look like Sabrina was about to say something too. I'll just cut her off,
Perfect.
which is great. I think the reason the Enneagram has taken off so much is because it basically says all of us, every person, and if you're on this call and you're like, the Enneagram is from the devil, it's a pentagram, I don't know what to tell you. I don't think it's the end all be all. I don't think it's the Bible. I think it's a helpful tool, just like Myers-Briggs or other things are. But I think the reason the Enneagram has taken off is because every person picks one of these 9 strategies, and these strategies basically say, here's how I cope with the problems of the world, but all the strategies don't work, and they're all bad, and they all are horrible things. You find out your number and you're like, this is really cool and interesting. And then you read a little bit more and you're like, this is terrible. I'm horrible. Like, what is wrong with me? Why do I do this? So as much as there are some people who have maybe more inbred resilience, I think there's areas in all of our lives that we refuse to go into. Mrs. P is a good example. She's like, I don't want to go back into these horrible areas of my past. I don't want to go in those areas. So in some ways, she's very resilient. Just giving you a little shout out, Mom, and tearing you down as your son. Like a good son that I am.
Yeah.
She's giving a thumbs up. So that's my thought. Sabrina, what were you going to say?
I don't know. That was really funny. So I'm thinking about that.
I derailed you. Like I
You did. Really threw me off.
Me said Pentagram in the chat.
Oh yeah, I saw that. Got to get it right. You got to get it right.
It's incredible.
I think I've seen, like, in my limited professional experience, I think I've seen a lot of very interesting personalities. I've seen some very stubborn personalities. I've seen personalities that have morphed with the use of substance abuse, and everything in between that spectrum. I don't think there's a single personality or person out there that would say that they can't change. I just think that there might be some personalities that are more resistant to it, and so it might take a little longer to get there.
That's really good.
But I don't think that it can be the biggest obstacle, the hardest struggle, and I think that person would be able to change.
Mm-hmm.
I really do.
That's good. That's helpful.
With the right support and a good therapist.
Yeah.
And
Shameful plug right there.
One of the, Jesus made us a lot of promises that we love and we hold on to. But one of the promises he made is that in this world, you will have suffering. And for Christians, in particular, we're all going to deal with it at some point. So Christian to Christian, think of you talking to a Christian friend who's going through a really hard time, and they're just beaten down, and they're like, this isn't fair. I didn't sign up for this. What's God doing? I know it's going to depend on what this actual situation is, but generally, what would you say to a Christian who maybe, has taken, like Sabrina said, they've kind of taken this position and they're stuck there? What general counsel would you give somebody who is in that mindset?
Yeah, so for me,
it's the Christian context too, not, keep it in the Christian.
Don't you just say everything happens for a reason and then that's it? And then they feel good?
yeah.
Well,
yeah.
Andrew just put something in the chat box, and he's saying it doesn't feel right to respond with someone and say that God will use this for his good.
Mm-hmm.
Problem solved.
Right.
You're suffering, but God's going to use it, so don't complain. I agree with you, Andrew. It doesn't feel right, because I would argue that it's not right to respond that way. My initial response would just be to shut up and listen, because there probably isn't anything that I can say that is the right thing to say, and I probably cannot fix whatever the problem is. When I had an office, I used to have this poster up on my wall it's actually it's the beginning lyric to one of my favorite songs, and it says, "Come tell me your troubles. I'm not your answer, but I'm a listening ear." And that's 100% of what I do. I will never have the answer to anyone's problems, but I can help you walk through it, and I can help them come to whatever their answer would be. And in the Christian context, it would be, what is their answer? What is God telling them that their answer is as well? That's how I would start with anybody that has some sort of, any hardship, no matter how little or how big it is. If it's hard for them, my response needs to just be to shut up and listen. And then from that listening, I can just figure out where they are.
Yeah, we're called to meet people where they are in our profession. That's one of the big little taglines of our profession. And also, I'm currently studying for my license, and one of the very first things, like social work 101, is, we're called to acknowledge, validate, and normalize people's feelings, which helps us meet them where they are. And so I think if somebody came to me, Christian or not, with a problem, which I listen to people's problems all day long, that's what I do for a living. I would say to them, you're right. It's not fair. It does suck. Absolutely. Like what Sabrina said, being an active listener and being a person who says, like, I have positive regard for you. I appreciate you enough to sit down and fully give you my attention and fully listen and fully hear what's going on in your life. Sometimes that's all it takes, because you're right. Like, especially as therapists, like, that was a big change in my professional life when I was like, oh, I can't fix your problem. Like, I can't make that trauma go away. I can't give you enough money to pay your rent. I can't fix these problems. And I'm not here to do that. I'm not trying to be like your savior. That's not my purpose. My purpose is to, like, carry this burden with you. And it takes a toll. It takes an emotional toll. But, like, I think it's, like, something that I was called to do. So.
And that's great advice for any of us on this call. What you both said, I think any of us on this call can take those away, even though we're not, like, professionals. I think the principles are something we can all apply.
Yeah.
So we only have a couple minutes left before we switch over. And I mean, like, literally a couple minutes, 2 minutes, but do either of you have an example of, either from your own life or somebody who has kind of was in that J curve where it was a downward, and then now we're on the other side of it? Either of you have, like, a little short story you could share? And if you don't, that's okay.
Rachel, do you have one?
Whoever got the better one can go.
Do you have one?
I I think I do.
Okay.
Yeah. I have a friend of
You get
mine
2
who,
minutes.
okay, I'll make it really short. I have a friend of mine who, her mom passed away in 2013. It was the second she had breast cancer. She was in remission. She relapsed. She passed away, and she passed away right when my friend came back from her honeymoon, like days after she found out she was pregnant with her first child. So it was just, she was elated. She just came back from her honeymoon. She's so excited to be married. She just found out she was having a kid. Like everything was great in her life. And then she comes home from this trip, finds out that her mom was back in the hospital. And then I think she passed away like about a month later. And it was specifically traumatic for her because the specific medication that she was on, it made her delirious. And my friend's mom ended up saying just these horribly nasty things to my friend. And that's some of the last things she said to her daughter before she passed away. And her mom was her best friend. Like there was nothing she didn't do with her mom. She was wildly close with her mom. And that was, I've been friends with her for a long time, and that was it probably was the darkest time of her life. And her grief was thick and heavy for a solid year and a half before she even kind of came up on the J curve. And she had done a year of grief counseling, and she said it just didn't make anything better because it didn't matter what anybody said. I just wanted my mom. That's all I wanted. I wanted nothing else but my mom. So I don't care what you have to say. I don't care that other people went through this. I just wanted my mom. Time and a lot of prayer was the only thing that helped her onto the other side. And eventually she got to the point where she went back into counseling. And she was able to actually receive the support and receive the care from the grief cohort that she was a part of. She started letting people come over a little bit more. She started going outside a little bit more. And it was that J. It was a very, very, very dark period before she ever saw the other side of that J curve.
Okay.
And a lot of prayer.
Yeah.
There was a lot of prayer that helped her through that.
That's a good story. Thank you for
Thanks for sharing that, Sabrina.
Yeah. Anthony, who's going to read the questions that came in, or how do we transition to that point?
Yeah, so we're going to try this, and we're going to just see how this goes. This could get a little crazy. I think we're going to extend the group for 5 extra minutes to 8:20. If you need to hop off at 8:15, feel free. You could hop off right now if you're not being forced to be here by any means. But normally we end right at 8:15. I just want to, and maybe the conversation will not produce anything more beyond, and we'll end at 8:15. But I'd love to tackle Hannah's question and Christine's question. And then maybe even if we don't have another chat, we'll try something wacky where we ask you guys to, if you have something you can even unmute, you could unmute yourself and just ask it directly if any of you are really feeling gung-ho. But let's see how much we get through between now and 8:20. So first question, Hannah brought up a great question. There she is. And she said, Rachel brought up a great point about people groups who've experienced suffering consistently through their lives because of the color of their skin, beliefs, etc. How can a J curve apply to more than just a single individual? Now, me as a white male, I'm going to just assert my dominance and answer this question first before anyone else. So I'm going to take my privilege as a white male and speak first. I'm just kidding. If anyone can't tell, I'm really joking. But I'll say something quick. The Bible is a story of people groups going through exactly what you're talking about. The whole Old Testament is the Israelites, this small nation being battered and beat up by other nations bigger than them. And they go into slavery for 400 years, and then they get out of slavery, and then they're stuck in the desert for 40 years, and they go through all this hardship. So the Bible is a story of a nation that was slaves that gets freed, but just suffering over and over and over again, going through the J curve, not just as individual people, but as a nation. So us in our 2020 worldview, we're very individualistic, right? But the rest of the world outside of the West is much more collective, that they see the world as groups of people more. And so I think the J curve applies just as much to people groups. And I know that like African Americans in history, in American history, when they were enslaved, a lot of these ideas of the promise of redemption, the promise of resurrection is what got them through that. Like the Bible was sort of what sustained them. And we talked a little bit about that last week, but that's my quick answer. Does anyone else have any quick thoughts? Because now I'm seeing more questions come in, so I want to try to get to these other ones.
That's good.
Mm-hmm.
All right, let's jump to the next one. So Christine said, one thing God does say that the suffering isn't for his good, but in one way, but it's one way in which he can bring the change in us that we can bring out in ourselves. Deeper connection with God, soften towards others, mature, complete, perseverance, character, hope. That's a really good point. Yeah, it's not that you're rejoicing for the suffering. You're rejoicing in the suffering, right? You're trusting God as you're going through it. Let's see another one. Omid said, it doesn't have to be the answer, but the fact that God uses it for good can be phrased instead of as a comfort. The after coming out on the other side of the suffering, that there will be something to show for it. My mom has been saying that to us since we were little kids. She says, you're going through this really hard thing, but this is going to give you a way to help other people in the future who go through similar hard things. Emma says, so I can understand God brings us through trials, and yes, we may even have stories about how God has redeemed those trials. How do we move forward, both embracing and trusting God without fear of being thrown through another J-curve trial? So I just talked for way too long, so someone else take over.
Anthony, can you read it one more time?
Yeah, so it says, so I can understand that God brings us through trials, and yes, we may even have stories about how God has redeemed those trials. How do we move forward, both embracing and trusting God without fear of being thrown through another J-curve? So basically, like if you're going to, I think, Emma, and you can clarify if you even, and I think let's turn off this unmute feature and just get rowdy, just see what happens. Dom, if you can turn that off. Emma, yeah, Emma, you want to clarify?
Okay, so it's not Emma, it's me. My name's Kaylin. Hi, I'm with Emma.
Hello.
Okay, so my question was more about how we've kind of all been through trials. I would assume most of us have been through trials. And like I said, God has redeemed those trials for us. But how do we move forward, seeing how God has redeemed the past, but not, for lack of a better word or phrase, holding a grudge of embracing the future. Again, so like knowing, okay, so I went through this problem. It was awful. God rescued me. I have faith in Jesus Christ. I can name all the scriptures. I got you. However, now I have to move forward again and step in faith. But what if God's going to do something else? And now it's going to be even harder. Maybe I don't have the finances like I did last time, or how am I going to come out of another trial? Or does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So
Okay.
what do you do if you're, like, you know that suffering will, and like you can't avoid suffering, like life is full of suffering. How do you not live in the fear that you know that suffering is coming again?
Right.
Correct. Yeah.
Got it.
Okay.
Well, I have a response since I'm already kind of talking. I guess I'll just jump right on in. I think it goes back to what Anthony said in the very beginning. It's your mindset. It's your perspective on your future. Because truth be told, life is gonna get crappy again for every single one of us. And it could be, you might be in a good place in life and it'll get crappy. You might be already in a really crappy position and it could get crappier. And that's just how life is. Like no one knows what's coming and we can't control it. But what we can control is our perspective on the matter. And so you have a choice. We can sit in always worrying about the fear of, well, what if this bad thing happens, or what if this bad thing happens? And you can riddle yourself with anxiety, or you can choose to rest in the hope that you get by knowing Christ, by walking with him, by having him guide you. Like those are kind of the options that we have as Christians. So instead of being like riddled by the fear and having it crush us, the opportunity that we have is that we get to rest in his comfort and his care. What was that quote that I loved so much? We need to follow Jesus into the suffering. But where's that redemption I love so much? But he comes with us. So even though it sucks and even though it's hard, dude, we're not alone. Dude, we get to do this with like the best counselor in the entire world. So
Wonderful.
there's like good stuff that comes from it, even though it's going to be hard. It's going to be good. It's going to be good.
Mike Spangler says that's why God chooses to not let us know what our future will be. We would say, I can't do this if we knew all the trials that we would experience in this life. Very true. Mm-hmm. And then Samantha said Romans 8:28, which is that famous passage where, Dom, if you want to actually just drop that in the chat. Amen, Mike, says Dominic. Which is basically that God works all things for the good of those who love him. And that was a paraphrase. It'll be a little bit better in the real Bible. But yeah, it's basically that. Dominic said, yeah, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. So yeah, so that's great. Does anyone else, we've ended the chat questions. Does anyone else have a question they want to drop in the chat, or would you like to unmute yourself? Maybe we'll take one more.
One, maybe I can just comment on that last topic. I think, given the brokenness that we live in a broken world, we should be surprised by how many things go right in our lives. And I think that instead of living in fear of what's going to go wrong next, maybe be really intentional about enjoying the moments each day where things are not going wrong. Because I think we can miss the two places you can't live in life are the past and the future. So to miss what's happening right now out of fear for something that may or may not come, I think is you're losing out on what's right in front of you.
John
Easy for me
Schrader
to say, but
yeah, for sure. John added on, in knowing there will be trial after trial throughout our life, I like to trust that God will instill faith and strength to persevere through the next better than the previous. And I think that's a good point. Beverly said, someone once told me it's never a good story when the good guys are always winning. True. And John said, stronger as a Christian and as a person. And yeah, I think that's all